I learned that silence was not discipline in his eyes, it was permission, and I learned it under fluorescent lights that made every brass crest on that wall shine like a medal someone else had earned. My name is Casey Morrison. At 05:17 on deployment day, my husband emptied our joint account while my left sleeve still held the warmth of his hand from a farewell hug in front of my unit. The notification landed on my phone in a clean, indifferent line of text. Transfer complete, available balance reduced, no action required. No action required. I stood in the muster hall with a folder of movement orders pressed against my ribs and understood, with a clarity that felt almost procedural, that he had chosen the exact minute when I could not leave, could not call the bank, could not afford to break formation, and had counted on me treating composure as duty while he treated it as consent. The hall smelled of floor wax, machine coffee, damp canvas, and that faint metallic tang that lives in old ventilation systems. Boots moved in disciplined bursts across polished concrete. Names were called, corrected, confirmed. Unit families lined the back wall in their pressed shirts and careful smiles, trying to look brave for each other, and in that choreography of fear and pride, Nolan looked like every model spouse command brochures ever wanted. Squared shoulders, easy grin, one hand at the small of my back like he was steadying me for the long absence ahead. He had done that hand placement for years in public. It read as tenderness to everyone else. To me, by then, it had become a signal. Perform calm. Maintain optics. Do not make me explain you. I turned my phone face down against my clipboard and signed the first accountability line they handed me. My handwriting stayed even. Initials where required. Date in full. Witness block left blank for the section chief. Across the aisle, Corporal Rains lifted his hand to wave at me, saw Nolan standing there, and shifted the wave into a scratch at his neck instead. Two spouses from Supply Readiness glanced at my name tape, then at Nolan, then at each other. Their expressions did not harden into cruelty. They softened into avoidance, which hurt more because it was practiced. I had seen it before in conference rooms and holiday dinners and command hallways, the quiet social agreement that if a man tells a polished story with confidence, no one asks the quieter woman whether any of it is true. The family readiness briefing started 30 minutes later. Metal chairs scraped in uneven rows. A lieutenant with a tired voice moved through slides on emergency contacts, legal assistance, allotments, casualty communication timelines. I knew every line before she said it because I had written half the local adaptation packet 3 cycles earlier. I had drafted the contingency tree for dependent support outages. I had built the escalation matrix for payroll errors during transit legs. None of that mattered in the social order of that room. In rooms like that, operations became a costume and status became the script, and Nolan understood scripts better than most. When the briefing paused for coffee and the farewell line formed near the unit crest, he leaned toward a knot of junior Marines and 2 spouses I recognized from base housing committee meetings. He did not lower his voice. "Casey tracks logistics, not real operations," he said, smiling as if he were granting me a harmless nickname. "She'll survive on procedures." A few people laughed because laughter is the safest currency in a hierarchy when you do not want to be seen choosing sides. One lance corporal looked down at his cup. One spouse murmured, "He's kidding," but she said it to the air, not to me. Nolan touched my elbow in that familiar public way, half guiding me as if the line belonged to him. I met no one's eyes at first because I was measuring. Not the insult, the room. Who absorbed it? Who repeated it? Who waited to see whether I would flinch before deciding how to file me in their own ranks? My throat tightened for one hard second, then released. I asked the admin chief for the next stack of forms and stepped out of Nolan's touch without making it look like a step. "I still need signatures on movement manifests," I said. My voice came out level, almost mild. The admin chief nodded too quickly, relieved to be given a procedural lane. "Right, yes, bring them here." I did. At 06:12, while Nolan was still collecting easy sympathy in the back of the hall, I opened the banking app again under the table edge and watched the transaction list populate in sequence. Primary transfer, then secondary transfer, then an internal sweep that closed the remaining savings bucket into 0. He had not panicked and emptied one account in a burst. He had staged a sequence, scheduled, confirmed, Executed at deployment lock time. I recognized intention the way I recognized fraudulent invoice architecture, timing, layering, plausible deniability in the memo fields, household reallocation, tax reserve, temporary liquidity adjustment. The language looked clean. The effect was total. 6 years earlier, when we married, Nolan had called me disciplined like it was a blessing. He liked telling people I was methodical, liked saying it with that admiring tilt that made older officers clap him on the shoulder and call him lucky. In private, the word changed shape. Methodical meant I should let him streamline our financial dashboards. Methodical meant I should trust him to move money for tax strategy because my work tempo was too high to track every account. Methodical meant if I questioned a transfer, I was being rigid. Then, over time, methodical became his evidence that I lacked instinct, lacked nerve, lacked the kind of force people misname as leadership. He never shouted. He redefined, redirected, and smiled while he did it. I did not litigate any of that in corridors. I did not pull peers aside to recite private injuries and ask for votes. Silence was the only privacy I thought I had left, and for a long time I confused privacy with protection. That morning corrected me. Silence was not neutral in a structure built on rank and narrative. Silence became data others interpreted in his favour. My restraint read as admission. My calm read as smallness. By the second deployment cycle of our marriage, people who had never seen my work product began explaining my own billet to me in simplified terms. "You keep the trains running," one captain had said at a holiday function, tapping his glass with a grin. "Nolan handles the real heat." I had run a multimodal resupply corridor through a storm closure 3 weeks before that dinner and prevented an entire training package from collapsing. No one at that table knew. Nolan did. He raised his glass anyway. In the muster hall, the farewell line advanced under polished brass and framed battle streamers. Wives kissed sleeves, parents gripped forearms, children waved handmade signs from the safe side of the rope line. I moved through signatures and handoffs with the precision I trusted when emotion threatened to breach containment. Manifest verified. Medical packet sealed. Device serials logged. 2 junior Marines thanked Nolan for keeping things steady at home, and he accepted it like an award. One of them turned to me and added, "Ma'am," with the quick correction of someone who realized he had forgotten my rank until the last second. Nolan leaned in close enough that only I could hear him over the crowd noise. "Do not start anything today," he said, still smiling for the room. "You're about to deploy. Be smart." The sentence was soft, almost affectionate, and shaped exactly like concern. It carried the old threat inside it. If I named what he had done, I would become the problem. I looked at him and saw not a husband in conflict, but a man who believed timing could erase accountability. "I am being smart," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not give him anger he could display as proof. I stepped forward as the line moved and handed my final packet to Gunnery Sergeant Halverson. He checked the tabs, glanced at my face, and paused, half a beat too long. He had heard Nolan's line earlier. Everyone had. "You good, Morrison?" he asked quietly, the question offered in the narrow space between concern and institutional caution. "I am mission ready, Gunny." He nodded, stamped the packet, and passed it to the runner. Procedure continued. At 0640, the transport call came over the hall speakers, sharp and metallic. People tightened their grips before they let go. Nolan opened his arms for one last embrace beneath the unit crest. I stepped into it because spectacle was still his chosen battlefield, and I refused to bleed on command. His cheek brushed mine. His voice landed at my ear. "You always overthink. Let it go." Then he stepped back with practiced solemnity, the picture of supportive spouse, while my phone carried the proof of what he had done in the inner pocket over my heart. I walked toward the embarkation lane with the rest of my section, boots striking the waxed floor in measured rhythm. No one stopped me. No one asked why my face had gone still. At the threshold, I turned once to scan the room the way I'd been trained to scan loading zones. Exits, bottlenecks, observers, points of failure. Nolan was still talking, still curating perception. The same people who had laughed were now nodding like he had offered wisdom instead of contempt. I understood then that the injury was not only financial and not only marital. It was architectural. He had built a version of me for public use. competent enough to serve him, smaller enough to dismiss. Something inside me hardened, not into rage, but into structure. I didn't need an audience to believe me yet. I needed a record that could survive one. I needed timestamps, authorizations, transaction paths, and the institutional patience to let facts outlive performance. I boarded with my section, took my assigned seat, and buckled in while engines rose to a low, steady roar. Through the small window I could still see the brass crest catching morning light above the hall entrance, bright as a promise and cold as metal. My name is Casey Morrison, and that was the morning my husband tried to convert my silence into his alibi. The seatbelt cut across my lap as the aircraft vibrated on idle thrust, and I kept my eyes on the netted cargo wall instead of the oval window where families were still gathered behind the glass. The loadmaster moved down the aisle checking harnesses, calling surnames in clipped cadence, and every answer came back sharp except mine. Morrison. I answered on the second prompt, my voice steady but a half-beat late, and the corporal across from me gave me the quick, curious glance people reserve for minor irregularities they do not intend to report. My phone was still in my breast pocket, on flight-safe mode, dark and warm from my hand. When the crew chief announced a departure hold for a maintenance signature, the cabin shifted from ritual silence into controlled restlessness. Helmets came off. Canteens clicked against seat frames. Two sergeants behind me started comparing route cards and contingency weather. I pulled my phone out to check whether the transfer alert had been a single strike or a system cascade. The screen populated in bursts, balance warnings, overdraft risk notices on scheduled bill pays, and then a flood from the family readiness channel Nolan had insisted we both join for transparency. He posted first at 0647 a full paragraph in that polished conversational tone he used when he wanted to pre-shape a room. Team, Casey is under pressure and can get procedural when stressed. She handles logistics paperwork, not operational decisions, so if she sounds intense in the next few weeks, please route through me and keep things calm. I read it once, then again, slower, because the words were almost elegant in their construction. He did not accuse me of anything explicit. He framed me as competent in a narrow lane and unstable outside it. He offered himself as a stabilizing interpreter. He posted it to spouses, junior Marines, and the Readiness NCO, who controlled most of the dependent support routing while we were in transit. 3 people reacted with thumbs-up icons. One spouse wrote, "Copy, thanks for looking out." Another added, "Deployment stress is real for everyone." No one asked why a husband was issuing command-adjacent guidance about a Marine officer's professional judgment. A private message followed from Corporal Rains, sent 30 seconds later. "Ma'am, just saw that. You okay?" The courtesy was genuine. The damage was public. Across the aisle, Staff Sergeant Keeler's phone buzzed with the same thread. He glanced at his screen, then at me, then back to his screen with a practiced neutrality I'd watched him use in briefings when senior voices collided. He did not smile. He did not intervene. He folded his phone shut and resumed adjusting the strap on his rifle case as if he had seen weather data and nothing more. In hierarchy culture, silence from a peer can be a kindness, a calculation, or a verdict. In that moment, I could not afford to guess which one it was. I opened Nolan's profile, thumb hovering over call. The old instinct arrived with all the old language. Handle this privately, preserve mission focus, do not create collateral noise. Then I saw his second post at 0650, this one tagged to the Readiness NCO by name. If there are any emergency disbursement approvals while Casey is gone, I can coordinate. She prefers checklists over improvisation, and we do not want family support delayed by formality. That line landed like a clean cut because it took my strongest trait and recast it as a defect in front of the exact network that controlled discretionary trust. The cabin door remained open for ventilation, and cold morning air slid through with jet fuel and wet tarmac in it. I could hear a child crying in the terminal and the distant reverse alarm of a pallet loader. I typed one sentence in the channel. Readiness matters. Please route official matters through command-designated contacts only. I deleted it before sending. Not because it was wrong, but because it could be reframed as defensive within seconds. Nolan understood that timeline better than most junior officers understood logistics lead times. He knew how fast a narrative calcified once posted in a group built on anxiety and social debt. Gunnery Sergeant Halverson climbed aboard and stopped near my row for a manifest recount. His jaw set when he saw the phones out, but he did not order them stowed yet. 2-minute correction, he said. Stay put. His eyes touched mine briefly, then dropped to his clipboard. Morrison, you still have the dependency contact matrix from last cycle? Yes, Gunny. Forward it to me when we level off. Copy. It was an ordinary request, administrative and dry, but Keeler heard it and let out a short breath through his nose. Good. She's got forms for everything, he said to no one in particular. The line was light enough to pass as banter. 2 Marines near the rear chuckled without looking up. The phrase could have died there. Instead, Keeler added, still fiddling with his strap, real operations people adapt. Paper people annotate. No one challenged him. No one endorsed him directly. The social math was the same as the hall. Preserve your own footing. Let the quieter target absorb the hit. Call it stress if anyone asks later. I felt heat rise up my neck, then drop, settling into that cold interior place where I built plans under pressure. I met Keeler's eyes long enough for him to know I had heard every word. Documentation is how adaptation survives audit, I said, and how pay gets fixed when people are downrange. He shrugged, unsmiling. If you say so, ma'am. The loadmaster signaled for devices down as the final signature came through. I powered off my screen with Nolan's thread still open and slid the phone into my pocket again. My pulse had gone narrow and precise. I could have answered in that channel and drawn blood with 2 paragraphs and 3 attachments. I had enough for a moral argument, not yet enough for a durable one. So I watched the cargo net quiver with engine vibration, counted 4 breaths in, 4 held, 4 out, and kept my mouth shut while the aircraft rolled. By the time we reached our first fuel stop after sunrise, the sky had flattened into hammered grey over the transit apron, and the day had taken on that suspended quality deployments create, where time is measured in check-ins, not clocks. We deplaned into a concrete terminal with waxed floors, fluorescent spill, and rows of bolted chairs facing televisions no one was watching. A legal assistance table had been set up near the vending machines for last-minute powers of attorney and dependent paperwork corrections. I recognised the captain staffing it from prior pre-deployment workshops, a patient officer with precise diction who had once thanked me for reducing a benefits backlog by 40% in 1 quarter. She looked at me now with formal neutrality and gestured toward a sign-in sheet. I wrote my name, rank, and billet in block letters, then stepped aside to call the credit union fraud line. The recorded menu asked for account number, then secondary verification, then most recent authorised transfer. I provided all 3. When the human operator came on, her tone shifted the moment she saw the transfer sequence. Lieutenant Morrison, I can place temporary holds on outbound channels tied to your individual authorization, but joint permissions require an additional review if the other signer initiated within credentials. She paused. Do you suspect credential compromise? I suspect deliberate depletion timed to my embarkation window, I said. I need full logs preserved, including metadata and IP signatures. I can submit preservation now. You will need legal follow-up for contested access. Submit it. Done. Reference number is 4972 Delta. I wrote the number on the back of my movement checklist because it was the only clean paper in reach. While I was still on hold for the metadata request, 2 officers from my broader tasking group approached the legal table, both from operations planning, both men who had accepted Nolan's jokes at social functions with that same thin smile of people who never risk their own standing to challenge a narrative. One of them, Major Whitlow, looked from the sign-in sheet to me and then to the captain. Is this about Pike and Morrison? He asked in a voice pitched low enough to seem discreet, high enough that 3 chairs around us could hear. We are not turning deployment processing into domestic theatre, are we? The captain did not answer immediately. She checked the sheet, then said, if a service member reports a financial access concern, legal intake is appropriate. Whitlow exhaled as if burdened by my existence. Understood, but she is keyed into mission financial workflows. If this becomes a grievance campaign, we need temporary reassignment for stability. He said stability the way Nolan had said calm, as if the word itself proved reasonableness. I ended the call and slid the phone into my pocket. Major, my workflow status is unaffected. His colleague, Captain Dyer, gave me a thin administrative smile. No one is attacking you, Lieutenant. We just cannot have personal volatility in disbursement lanes. The line was so close to Nolan's that for a second I tasted metal, not fear, recognition. He had already made calls, ceded concerns, offered his translation of me to men who prized composure, but rarely examined who they demanded it from. I could have challenged Whitlow there, in front of the vending machines and bolted chairs and the legal table with its stack of blank forms. I could have listed every crisis ledger I had corrected while he was still debating slide colours for briefings. I could have named the nights I rebuilt fuel forecasts at 0200, so operations could pretend competence at 800. None of that would have mattered without record. I turned to the captain at legal. Request formal intake, I said. Financial exploitation, possible credential misuse, command-adjacent reputational interference tied to disbursement authority. Whitlow gave a short laugh without humour. That is a dramatic filing. Dramatic would be shouting, I said. This is paperwork. The captain's eyes flicked to Whitlow, then back to me. Do you have supporting documentation? I have transaction IDs, timestamps, and preservation reference 4972 Delta. I will submit full packet once logs are produced. She slid a form toward me. Complete blocks 1 through 6. Attach whatever you have now. Dyer folded his arms. For record, I recommend suspension of her mission financial permissions pending review. I signed block 1, then block 2, date and time in full. My hand did not shake. For record, I said, I recommend you read the actual review once it exists. No one spoke for several seconds. Fluorescent lights hummed over us. Ice dropped in a vending machine with a hollow clatter. A lance corporal at the far chairs pretended to scroll his phone while listening to every word. I completed the form, attached screenshots, wrote the fraud reference number in black ink, and requested a receipt copy with intake stamp. The captain provided it without comment. Whitlow took one step back as if disengaging from contamination. We will let legal sort it, he said, and he walked away with Dyer beside him, both men moving quickly toward the operations gate, as though punctuality itself could launder what they had tried to do. I remained at the table until the captain finished indexing my packet. She placed it in a manila folder, pressed the stamp, and handed me a duplicate. Lieutenant Morrison, she said quietly, do not discuss merits in open transit spaces. Keep your documentation chain clean. I intend to. When I returned to the boarding lane, Keeler looked up from his seat and then at the folder in my hand. More forms? He asked. Yes, I said. He smirked, small and brief. Figures. I sat down, buckled in, and set the folder flat against my thigh like a field map. The aircraft door sealed with a hydraulic thud. Engines climbed. Around me, men adjusted straps and traded routine complaints about rations, weather, and sleep. I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had finally chosen the forum where truth could not be interrupted by charm. Silence was not surrender anymore. It was evidence discipline. Silence was not surrender anymore. It was evidence discipline. I kept my hand on the folder as the aircraft lifted, banked, and found altitude, and I listened to the structure around me settle into its familiar vocabulary. Engine vibration through the seat frame, webbing straps tapping aluminum ribs, clipped acknowledgements from crew who trusted checklists more than personalities. That trust had always made sense to me. Procedures did not flatter you. They did not improvise your identity for social comfort. They either held under pressure or they failed on record. Keeler dozed with his chin to his chest before we hit cruising height. Across from me, a corporal traced weather contours on a laminated card, lips moving silently through alternates and fuel margins. I opened my intake duplicate just enough to check the stamp, then closed it again and rested my head back against the cargo net. Fatigue arrived in waves, but never fully took me. Each time my eyes shut, memory supplied Nolan's voice in different rooms, always polished, always calibrated to leave no bruise that could be photographed. The first year we were married, he learned quickly that public admiration followed any man who appeared to champion a disciplined woman in uniform. At promotion dinner, when my orders came through ahead of schedule, he stood with a glass in hand and said, "To Casey, the most organized officer in 3 zip codes." People laughed kindly at first because it sounded like praise. Then he added, "If the world ends, she will survive by alphabetizing the emergency." More laughter, louder now, and someone at the table said, "Good thing you're the instinct in that household, Pike." Nolan lifted his glass in agreement and did not look at me while he drank. I smiled because that was what the room required. I told myself at the time that marriage meant tolerating tone, not litigating every careless line. The pattern matured anyway. At home, he handled the financial dashboard because he was faster with interfaces. He set permissions to simplify tax season. When I asked why my login stopped showing external transfers, he kissed my forehead and said, "Casey, you already carry operations pressure. Let me carry this piece." When I asked again 2 months later, he sighed as if burdened by my anxiety and moved money from savings to an account labelled short-term reserve while I stood at the sink, still in boots. "This is strategy," he said. "You think in forms. I think in flow." By the second year, his vocabulary had migrated into my workplace without me noticing the route. At a command holiday function under white lights and rented linen, Captain Varin asked where I worked in the planning stack. Nolan answered before I could. "She keeps the rails aligned. I handle the messy judgment calls at home." Varin nodded with the lazy confidence of someone who had never checked my products against outcomes. "Every operator needs admin support," he said. "Good pairing." I had rerouted a multimodal resupply package around a weather closure 48 hours earlier and kept 2 training cycles from cancellation. Nolan knew because he had watched me rebuild the matrix at our kitchen table until after midnight. He still accepted the compliment like fact. The injuries were rarely dramatic. They were cumulative, procedural, and deniable. A seating chart at a battalion social where my name card was shifted 2 places down after Nolan arrived. A spouse committee message where he volunteered to translate Casey's process language for families. A weekend barbecue where he laughed while telling 3 sergeants that I scheduled grocery runs in quarter-hour blocks. "If we run out of milk, she submits a requisition," he said. They laughed. I watched one of them repeat the joke 3 days later in operations, and when I corrected a risk assumption in his deck, he smirked and asked if I had filed it in triplicate. There were private moments, too quiet to classify as fights and too sharp to forget. Once, after I noticed 12,000 missing from savings and asked for transaction history, Nolan set his fork down with deliberate calm and said, "Do you want a marriage or an audit?" I answered, "Both require transparency." He nodded, almost proud of my diction, then replied, "Transparency without trust is accusation. Choose carefully." He slept soundly that night. I sat at the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand and no permissions to verify what had moved. Another evening, after a long field week, I told him a senior had asked whether I was paper support. Nolan did not deny his role. He tightened his tie in the mirror and said, "People need shorthand. If I let them think you are mission center, they will overtask you and burn you out. I am protecting you from your own standards." The sentence held just enough concern to make self-defense feel ungrateful. That was his most refined tactic. Convert diminishment into care, then punish objection as disloyalty. The aircraft hit mild turbulence over open water, and the cabin lights flickered once before stabilizing. I opened my eyes and fixed on the rivet line above the emergency placard until the shaking eased. My body remembered those old conversations with alarming fidelity. My chest tightened at his cadence, even when the words were years old. The difference now was evidentiary. At 0517, he had moved from narrative coercion into traceable fraud, and traceable behavior belonged to institutions larger than his charm. By the time the loadmaster called descent, the cabin had turned quieter and less performative. Fatigue pressed flat under routine. We dropped into a regional military airfield used for staging and legal processing before final movement, rain building during approach and drumming against the fuselage as we taxied toward a low concrete terminal washed in fluorescent spill. We disembarked in files, collars up, boots striking wet tarmac in unison, and moved through security into a corridor that smelled of coffee, damp wool, and copier toner. A temporary legal intake desk had been set up beside a bank of locked mailboxes. The captain from the fuel stop station was there, now with an overfilled accordion folder and a look that suggested she had slept less than anyone in uniform. I checked in, logged my presence, and requested confirmation that my intake had been forwarded to Command Legal. She scanned her queue, found my case number, and gave a brief nod. "Forwarded and tagged for review," she said. "You will receive an appointment window once JAG triages." Her tone stayed neutral, but she added quietly, "Keep all bank communications. Full headers, not screenshots alone." "I have preservation reference and initial logs," I said. "Good. If anyone asks you for verbal summaries, decline and route to filing." I had just stepped away when an older woman in a dark raincoat rose from the waiting bench near the exit and said my name without raising her voice. "Lieutenant Morrison?" She held herself with the posture of someone who had spent years at service counters where panic arrived hourly and volume solved nothing. I turned. "Yes. I am Elaine Voss, retired auditor, Base Credit Union, now Contract Compliance Review." She lifted a clear evidence sleeve sealed with tamper tape. Inside was a plain black USB drive and a folded printout on heavy paper, both labelled with my account suffix and the fraud reference number I had written on my checklist. "I requested in-person transfer because your case tripped a deployment timing anomaly we monitor." I did not take the sleeve yet. "On whose authority?" "Account holder consent path through fraud intake and command legal liaison. Captain Reddin authorized delivery to you directly to preserve chain." She gestured toward the desk. The captain looked up, met my eyes, and gave one short confirming nod. "You can decline and wait for digital routing," Mrs. Voss said. "Given current narrative pressure around your status, I recommend physical custody with receipt." Narrative pressure. She did not know Nolan, yet she had named the dynamic precisely. I accepted the sleeve with both hands. The plastic was cool and slightly rigid from the rain. Inside, the printout showed a transaction ladder in narrow font rows: timestamp, channel, authorization token, destination node, memo field. The first line was 0517:03. The second, 0517:41. The third, 0518:12. Each move was technically valid at first glance. Each one carried the same hardship code normally reserved for emergency family support during deployment disruption. Under destination, a corporate account appeared repeatedly. Redline Advisory Group LLC. I had never heard that name. Mrs. Voss pointed to a boxed notation at the margin. "Secondary authorization metadata indicates your credential hash," she said, "but the device signature shows execution from a desktop endpoint previously associated only with Staff Sergeant Pike. The token sequence was pre-staged. It ran as a scheduled series during your embarkation lock window. That is not improvisation. That is planning." Rain rattled harder against the terminal windows. Behind us, someone dragged a duffel across tile, zipper teeth scraping with a dry metallic sound. I looked at the code column again. This hardship flag would have accelerated processing. "It bypassed ordinary spouse transfer delay holds," she said. "Flagging false hardship is a fraud multiplier. It also creates a sympathetic cover story if questioned quickly." She tapped another line. "There is more. 2 prior micro-transfers over 6 months, both under threshold alerts, routed through the same corporate node, then consolidated. Small enough to look like subscription noise, large enough in aggregate to map intent." My mouth went dry, not from surprise but from confirmation. Pattern, layering, plausible language. The architecture I had recognized under a table in the muster hall was now printed in black and white with routing detail. "Why were you watching this pattern?" I asked. "Because it stopped being isolated." Her face tightened, not with dramatics but memory. 3 cases in 1 quarter. Deployment day depletion, hardship coding, spouse narrative preceding. Different units, similar mechanics. I drafted the anomaly trigger before I retired, then stayed on contract when command asked for continuity. She held my gaze. "Predatory people count on tempo and embarrassment. Tempo is manageable. Embarrassment is optional." I exhaled slowly. "What do you need from me right now?" "Receipt signature, time of transfer, and statement that media remains sealed until your review. Then submit the packet through legal intake, not peer channels. Do not plug the drive into shared systems. Ask for forensic imaging first." She offered a clipboard with a pre-formatted chain of custody sheet. "Also note any prior access restrictions he imposed. Controlling dashboards is often part of the same scheme." I signed date and time in full and wrote 1 sentence under supplementary notes. Repeated account visibility limits imposed by spouse since year 1 of marriage. Requests for access deferred with non-technical justifications. Mrs. Voss checked the entry, initialed the margin, and tore off my copy. As she passed me the duplicate, she said, "Lieutenant, men like this borrow institutional language to make theft sound like stewardship. Do not debate language with him. Submit architecture." It was the most practical kindness anyone had offered me in months. Captain Reddin called my name from the desk and motioned me over. "Command Legal added a note," she said, sliding a short form across the counter. "JAG review window likely within 48 hours. Mark whether you request interim financial protections." "Yes," I said, and checked every applicable box. Freeze contested channels, preserve records, suspend discretionary withdrawals, restrict hardship recoding pending review. She stamped the form and attached it to my intake jacket with a red tab. When I turned back, Mrs. Voss had already put on her raincoat and was heading toward the side exit with the measured pace of someone who understood that useful work often looked unremarkable from across a room. She did not ask for gratitude. She did not offer reassurance she could not guarantee. She had delivered evidence, procedure, and a way forward. I returned to the staging bay with the sealed sleeve under my arm and the stamped forms in my folder. Keeler glanced at the evidence bag and then away. Unreadable now. Whitlow was near the far wall, speaking in low tones with Dyer. Both men stopped talking when I approached the seating row, then resumed when I sat. I did not meet their eyes. I logged the transfer time in my notebook, photographed the chain of custody form beside my watch for independent timestamp corroboration, and powered my phone long enough to save the image to encrypted storage before shutting it down again. Outside, rain tracked down the terminal glass in straight silver lines. Inside, fluorescent light flattened rank and fatigue into the same pale colour. I rested my palm over the sealed USB and felt the hard edges through plastic. Nolan had spent years converting my restraint into his stage. In that corridor, with toner in the air and wet boots squeaking across tile, restraint became something else entirely. A method for carrying proof intact until the right room opened. I came back to staging with the chain of custody copy still warm from the stamp and the interim protection request logged under 4972 Delta. The intake clerk redirected me immediately into the processing room, and the next administrative push began before my pulse had fully settled. The room opened, and then it tried to close around me again. A staff duty clerk wheeled in a grey metal cart stacked with boxed meals and a sign-in binder for the afternoon legal processing block, and Whitlow moved first, as men like him always did when procedure created fresh territory to control. He stood near the intake desk and spoke to Captain Reddin in a voice pitched for administrative legitimacy. "Given current allegations, I want Morrison held out of disbursement prep until we get command guidance." He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the binder, at the stamp tray, at any object that made exclusion sound like workflow instead of judgment. Captain Reddin kept her expression neutral. "You can submit that recommendation in writing, Major. I am submitting it verbally now to prevent immediate risk." "Verbal is not a record." Dyer stepped in beside him, arms folded tight against his chest. "Then mark this as preliminary operational caution. We have a closed session in 20. She does not need to attend." I sat with the sealed sleeve against my thigh and listened to the language tighten around me. Closed session, operational caution, preliminary risk. None of it contained a fact. All of it carried status. Keeler watched from 2 rows down, boot tapping once, then still. 2 junior Marines at the coffee urn went quiet mid-sentence. I stood and crossed to the desk. Not fast, not hesitant, just online. "Captain, if there is a restriction request tied to my billet, I request a written copy and authority citation." Whitlow finally faced me. "Lieutenant, this is not punitive. This is prudent. Then you can document prudence." His jaw flexed. "You are in active marital conflict and have filed a legal complaint during movement. That is volatility by definition." "No," I said. "That is reporting." The fluorescent lights hummed hard enough to feel in my teeth. Reddin pulled a fresh form from the stack, set it on the counter, and rotated it toward Whitlow with 2 fingers. "Recommendation block is here, Major. Name, basis, duration, authorizing chain. If you want her excluded, own it on paper." For 2 beats, he did not touch the pen. Dyer did. He took it, wrote quickly, slid the form back. Redden read it in silence, then stamped receipt and handed me a carbon copy without commentary. I scanned the line item, temporary removal from mission-critical financial prep pending stability review, requested by Captain Dyer, concurred verbally by Major Whitlow. No supporting evidence attached. I folded the copy once and placed it inside my notebook behind the chain of custody sheet. At 13:20, a sergeant from operations opened the conference room door and called names for the closed prep session. Whitlow, Dyer, Keeler, 2 disbursement analysts from a sister unit. Mine was not called. The sergeant paused at me, checked his list again, then looked toward Whitlow for confirmation. Whitlow gave the smallest nod in the world, a movement so slight it could be denied later. The sergeant shut the door. The corridor swallowed the click of the latch. I remained by the intake desk because leaving would have made their narrative easier. Removed Officer Storms off, emotionally compromised, unable to maintain composure in administrative hold. Instead, I asked Captain Redden for a blank memorandum template and sat at the end of a bolted bench beneath a wall map of air corridors. I wrote what had happened in concise, numbered lines. Time of exclusion, names present, stated rationale. Absence of evidence, copy received. I attached Dyer's recommendation carbon and my intake receipt in order. Then I requested acknowledgement of submission to legal chain. When I returned the packet to the desk, Redden stamped it and initialed the corner. "Received," she said. Her voice softened by half a degree. "You are doing this correctly." Correctly was not comfort, but it was oxygen. A phone at the far workstation rang. The clerk answered, listened, then covered the receiver and called to Redden. "Readiness liaison requesting verbal clarification on Lieutenant Morrison's authority status. Says spouse reported she has been suspended." Spouse. Not named because he did not need to be. Redden held out her hand for the phone. "Legal intake does not process authority suspensions by spouse narrative," she said into the line. "If command issues a formal order, it will come through command channels. Until then, status is unchanged." She listened again, eyes cutting briefly to me. "No, I will not provide off-record commentary." She hung up and made a notation in the call log. External contact. Logged. Outcome entered. I thanked her with a single nod and returned to my bench. My pulse stayed, level by intent, not by ease. Through the conference room wall I could hear the muffled cadence of briefing voices and the dry scrape of a projector cart being moved. I knew that room's structure even without seeing it. Rectangular table, central screen, disbursement flowchart I had designed during the last cycle, my risk annotations likely still in the footer while my chair sat empty. Exclusion was not just being denied a seat. It was watching your work used as proof that you were optional. 3 days earlier, I had corrected a dependency pay latency model for this exact movement and built a contingency trigger for emergency hardship fraud flags. I had emailed the draft to Whitlow at 2214 with 2 recommended controls. He replied at 2231. Solid admin support, Morrison. Ops will convert to actionable language. He had attached my spreadsheet to his next day brief with my name removed from the first slide. That memory arrived now with clinical clarity, not because I was dwelling, but because patterns mattered. Pattern in finances, pattern in speech, pattern in who received credit and who received caution labels. At 14:05, the conference door opened and men came out in clusters, carrying binders and untouched coffee cups. Keeler passed me first and slowed just enough to look at the sealed evidence sleeve on my lap. "Still collecting paperwork," he said. "Still collecting facts." He gave a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "At some point, the mission needs operators, not archivists." "At every point," I said, "the mission needs records that survive inquiry." His smile dropped. He moved on. Whitlow came out next, speaking to Dyer in the low, urgent tone of men who know their influence depends on speed. I caught one fragment as they passed. "If JAG takes this seriously, we reframe as welfare misunderstanding. Reframe, not review." I wrote the phrase in my notebook and underlined it once. By the second week of October, I had started measuring people less by rank insignia and more by whether their verbs changed when documents appeared. The corridor clock clicked to 14:22 when a legal specialist in a navy blue service uniform entered from the side hall carrying a locked black case with a red evidence stripe. She signed the intake ledger, exchanged brief words with Redden, and disappeared into interview room B. 10 minutes later, she came back out for 2 names. Major Whitlow, Captain Dyer. Bring your exclusion recommendation and supporting basis. Whitlow frowned. For what purpose? Command legal review. He looked toward me as if I had personally rearranged federal statute. We have movement priorities. The specialist did not blink. So does legal. Room B, now. They went. The social climate in the corridor shifted by a few measurable degrees. Conversations shortened, voices dropped. One lance corporal who had watched everything from the vending machines straightened his posture and opened his notebook for real this time, pen moving quickly. Keeler stopped pretending to read his phone and started reading it. Redden stamped 2 incoming forms with crisp, hard strikes. I remained seated until the specialist returned and asked, Lieutenant Morrison, are you available? I am. Bring your intake duplicate, chain of custody copy, and any communications regarding authority status. I stood, collected my folder and sleeve, and followed her down the hall. Interview room B had no windows, only a long table, 6 chairs, a wall-mounted display, and the cold, clean smell of recently wiped laminate. Whitlow and Dyer sat on the right side, both silent, both trying to look inconvenienced rather than concerned. Keeler stood at the back wall with arms behind him, notepad tucked under one elbow like a shield. The specialist indicated the seat opposite them. Wait here. I sat. I placed my materials square to the table edge, corners aligned. I did not touch the seal on the USB sleeve. 3 hours passed between exclusion and what came next, and the hours had done what time in institutions often did. Burned away tone, left record. The door opened again. Captain Adrienne Shaw entered with a legal clerk and a second case file thick enough to bow at the centre. I recognised her from command-level training modules and one distant briefing where she spoke for 14 minutes, without once wasting a verb. She wore service dress immaculate to the millimetre, but it was her gaze that altered the room. She looked first at the table layout, then at the evidence sleeve, then directly at me. Lieutenant Casey Ann Morrison, she said, full rank and full name. Logistics Control Officer, Dependency Disbursement Liaison, current complainant of record in fraud intake 4972 Delta. Yes, ma'am. Remain seated. Then she turned to Whitlow and Dyer. For clarity, Lieutenant Morrison is not under misconduct review in this matter. She is the reporting party. No one answered. Shaw did not wait for one. She set the thick file on the table, opened it, and slid 3 documents onto the display feed. The screen lit with transaction ladders, authorization trails, and a highlighted routing node I already knew by sight. Redline Advisory Group, LLC. Under it, cross-reference tags linked to 2 additional cases from separate units. I have been monitoring deployment day dependency anomalies across this command cluster for 7 weeks, Shaw said. This report matches an active pattern. Whitlow shifted in his chair. Ma'am, with respect, we were trying to preserve operational continuity. Shaw looked at him once, expression flat. Operational continuity is not preserved by sidelining complainants before evidentiary review. She picked up my memorandum from the exclusion event and tapped the stamped corner. Lieutenant Morrison documented time, participants, rationale language, and chain receipt within minutes. Methodologically exemplary. Precisely what command asks for when facts are contested. The words landed with the force of a gavel because they were not emotional and not vague. Methodologically exemplary. In front of the same officers who had called me unstable without a single attached exhibit. Dyer cleared his throat. Ma'am, our concern was personal conflict contaminating mission lanes. Shaw selected another file and projected a call log. Readiness liaison contact at 1331 claimed spouse reported suspension of Lieutenant Morrison's authority. No such order exists. Legal intake corrected the record in real time. She let the line sit there, then added, contamination entered through rumour, not reporting. Keeler's eyes dropped to the floor. Shaw turned back to me. Lieutenant, did you at any point disseminate case merits through peer channels? No, ma'am. Intake only, legal chain only. Did you maintain evidence seal integrity on media transfer from Miss Elaine Voss? Yes, ma'am. Chain signed, timed and witnessed, media unopened pending forensic imaging. She nodded once. Good. In that room, recognition was not applause. It was procedural restoration in complete sentences. My seat was no longer provisional. My language no longer needed translation by men invested in shrinking it. Shaw flipped to the final page on top of her stack and addressed the clerk. Enter this. Complainant credibility supported by contemporaneous documentation and independent financial anomaly correlation. Any temporary authority restriction requests submitted without evidence are held in abeyance pending formal review. The clerk typed, keys sharp in the quiet. Whitlow stared at the projected ladder as if willpower could blur the timestamps. Dyer's hands were clasped too tightly, knuckles pale at the joints. No one looked at me now with pity or amusement. They looked the way people look when performance has met record, and record has won the room for the moment that mattered. Shaw closed the file halfway, leaving one tab visible at the edge. We proceed to forensic packet review next, she said. Lieutenant Morrison, keep your documents ready. I rested my palm on the sealed sleeve and felt, for the first time since 0517, that the structure was no longer mine alone to hold. Captain Shaw did not raise her voice, and because she did not, every other sound in interview room B became sharper. The soft hum of the display fan, the faint clink of a pen against the clerk's ring binder, the rain tapping in small bursts against ductwork somewhere beyond the wall. She held out her hand toward the sealed sleeve on my side of the table. Chain transfer, please. I passed it to her without breaking the seal. She checked the tamper tape, read Elaine Voss's signature line, then nodded to the legal specialist in navy blue. Forensic imaging now. Witnesses present. Read the seal identifier aloud before opening. The specialist placed the sleeve on a sterile mat, angled a small camera down, and recited the identifier code in full while the clerk typed each character into the record. The plastic parted with a dry, precise sound. She removed the USB drive with gloved fingers and inserted it into a right-block device connected to the secured terminal at Shaw's left. No one spoke while the imaging progress bar moved across the screen in narrow blue increments. When it reached 100%, Shaw said, "Hash verify." The specialist read the source and image hashes twice, matching line for line. Shaw looked at me briefly. "Lieutenant Morrison, you understand this copy is now evidentiary and your original remains sealed after verification?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Preserve your receipt copy. You did this correctly." Then she looked at the clerk. "Bring in Staff Sergeant Nolan Pike." The room shifted without anyone moving much. Keeler straightened from the back wall and then seemed to think better of it, settling again with his shoulders tight. Dyer swallowed and reached for the water cup in front of him, his hand not fully steady. Whitlow stared at the display feed as if trying to read ahead of what had not yet appeared. 30 seconds later, the door opened. Nolan stepped in wearing travel utilities, and the expression I had seen him use at readiness briefings, solemn concern with a trace of patience, meant to suggest he was here for everyone's good. He took one look at the seating layout, at me opposite him, at Shaw at the head of the table, and recalibrated into formal deference. "Captain," he said, "Staff Sergeant Pike reporting as requested." Shaw did not invite him to perform. "Take the remaining seat. You are present for administrative legal review regarding contested transfer activity and related command impact statements. You will answer questions directly." Nolan sat. He didn't look at me at first. When he did, it was quick, almost private, that familiar signal to keep this in-house. It had worked for years. It had no purchase in that room. Shaw touched the display control and projected the transaction ladder full screen. At 051703 on deployment day, a transfer moved from joint account ending 8841 to Redline Advisory Group LLC under hardship code H27. At 051741 and 051812, two additional transfers completed from linked savings and reserve sub-accounts, draining available funds. Secondary authorization token carried Lieutenant Morrison's credential hash. Endpoint signature did not. It executed from desktop endpoint NPK-home-04, previously authenticated to your personal access profile. She turned one page in her file. "Do you contest any component of that statement?" Nolan exhaled slowly, then chose his words with legal caution. "Ma'am, we had marital financial discussions. I handled transfers with implied consent in a stressful deployment context. Hardship coding may have been selected in error by the platform. Shaw's gaze did not shift. The platform does not auto-select H27 in a 3-transfer sequence with pre-stage scheduling metadata. User action is required each step. Do you contest that? He opened his mouth, paused, then said, I am not a banking technician. Neither am I, Shaw said. That is why we use forensic review. She signaled the specialist who brought up the metadata pane. On screen, the sequence mapped in brutal clarity. Tasks scheduled at 0312, credentials loaded at 0314, execution queued to deployment embarkation window, hardship code manually affirmed 3 times. Under destination ownership, corporate registration records appeared with Nolan Pike listed as controlling member for Redline Advisory Group LLC. The registration date sat 9 months before the transfers. For the first time since he entered, colour left Nolan's face in a visible wave from cheekbones to jaw. Whitlow leaned forward. Captain, if I may, this still reads like a domestic allocation dispute, unless criminal intent is adjudicated. Shaw turned her head toward him with exact slowness. Major, you attempted to remove Lieutenant Morrison from Mission Financial Authority before review, based on rumour sourced through spouse narrative. We are now looking at a scheduled depletion pattern using false hardship coding and a controlled shell account. This is not a tone disagreement. She tapped the screen once. This is architecture. Dyer tried to recover ground. Our concern remained continuity, ma'am. And continuity is now served by accurate status designation, Shaw said. Record this. Lieutenant Morrison's authority remains intact pending no derogatory findings against her. The exclusion recommendation submitted at 1320 is withdrawn from effect and retained only as process exhibit. The clerk typed quickly. Shaw continued, crisp and unhurried. Interim protective financial orders are approved effective immediately. Freeze contested outbound channels, suspend discretionary hardship recoding on linked accounts, preserve complete logs, and notify military pay liaison and partner credit union compliance desk. Command referral initiated for suspected fraud and false coding misuse. The concise reversal happened in less than 2 minutes, in fewer than 24 sentences, and it was unmistakable. I did not gain sympathy. I regained standing on record. Shaw looked directly at me when she delivered the final line. Lieutenant Morrison is complainant, not suspect. No one in the room could pretend they had not heard it. By 1510, the clerk had printed the protective order summary and placed copies at each seat. Nolan picked his up, scanned the first paragraph, and his lips parted as if to object, then closed. He set the page down carefully, too carefully, like brittle material that might cut him if handled wrong. Shaw addressed him without heat. Staff Sergeant Pike, you are directed to cease contact with financial institutions on these accounts, except through counsel or official review channels. Any attempt to alter, delete, or reroute records after this notice will be logged as post-notice interference. Do you understand? He cleared his throat once. I understand the instruction, ma'am, but this is excessive for a family matter. Shaw angled the next document toward him. Family matters do not include false hardship coding tied to deployment status. Sign acknowledgement. His hand hovered over the pen. I would like representation before signing. You are acknowledging receipt of instruction, not admitting liability. Sign. He signed. The signature line trembled at the final letter. Shaw shifted to Whitlow and Dyer. You will submit corrected authority notification to readiness channels within the hour. Language will state that Lieutenant Morrison retains full billet status and that prior suspension rumour was inaccurate. Copy legal intake and command admin. Whitlow's composure cracked at the edges. Captain, broadcasting correction at that scale could damage unit confidence. The damage came from falsehood, Shaw said. Correction restores confidence. Dyer attempted one last procedural shield. Can this be handled quietly? Shaw's expression stayed flat. It is being handled formally. Quietly was your earlier strategy. Silence settled hard over the table. Keeler at the back wall shifted his weight, then went still again. He had spent 2 days reducing me to paperwork as a joke. Now paperwork was the only language protecting anyone in that room from further self-injury. Shaw asked the specialist to project external contact logs. The 1331 readiness call appeared, then a second entry at 1416 from the same liaison seeking unofficial confirmation that I was unstable for financial authority. Outcome field, denied. Directed to formal channels, rumour correction pending. Shaw pointed with her pen. External contact resolved, logged and answered. No further off-record status guidance authorised. She moved to another tab. Physical evidence, USB imaged, hash verified, source resealed, chain intact. Print trace submitted. Preservation request confirmed with credit union. Distinctive detail, recurring deployment day hardship coding pattern across 3 cases, now formally correlated. She closed that tab and looked up. Authority status is corrected on record. Exclusion effect is withdrawn and retained only as exhibit. No off-record reinterpretation is authorised. Her language was legal, but underneath it I heard something steadier. No loose ends, no private reinterpretation later. Nolan finally looked straight at me. The practiced empathy was gone, replaced by calculation running out of options in real time. "Casey," he said, then corrected himself under Shaw's stare. "Lieutenant Morrison and I can resolve reimbursement without escalating to command referral." I answered him only once. "You already escalated when you moved it at 0517. He nodded as if conceding a small point in negotiation, then tried again. "I was trying to keep our finances fluid during deployment pressure. You know how these systems jam." Shaw intervened before I had to. "The systems did not jam. You staged timed extraction under false code. Your explanatory framing is noted and unpersuasive at this stage." His jaw tightened. He started another sentence. "With respect, Captain, she has a pattern of over..." and stopped. For a moment no sound came out at all. He drank water, set the cup down and looked at the screen instead of any person. Whitlow's destabilization was quieter but just as visible. He kept reordering the same 3 pages in front of him, aligning corners, then misaligning them, then aligning again, as if geometry could restore authority. Dyer's face had gone pale beneath the fluorescent wash. When he spoke, his voice carried a dry catch. "We acted on concern." Shaw replied, "Then your correction will reflect concern for fact." She stood, signalling that the key determinations were complete. Next actions are as follows. Finance compliance executes freezes and preservation notices before close of business. Command admin issues status correction to all recipients of the prior rumour path. Investigative referral packet goes forward with forensic attachments and contact logs. Lieutenant Morrison will receive certified copies of protective orders and authority affirmation before departure from this facility. She gathered her folder. Questions relevant to process only. No one spoke. Shaw looked to me one final time. "Lieutenant, do you have any additional evidence not yet logged?" "Yes, ma'am. Prior messages from Staff Sergeant Pike to readiness channels characterizing my authority as unstable and requesting routing through him." "Submit to Clark before 1600. "I will." "Good." She turned for the door. The specialist followed with the resealed media and evidence case. The clerk remained to collect signatures, each page stamped and time-marked. As forms circulated, Nolan failed twice to recap his pen and left small blue marks on his thumb. Whitlow signed without reading the last page, had it returned, then signed again in the correct block. Dyer coughed into his fist when the corrected authority notice was placed in front of him, read the first line, and stared at it long enough that the clerk had to prompt him. "Captain, signature required there." When the final carbon copies were distributed, I placed mine in order: protective financial directives first, authority affirmation second, rumour correction instruction third, referral notation fourth. The stack felt heavier than paper should have, not because it carried revenge, because it carried enforceability. Nolan stood as if to say something to me outside formal record. Shaw was already gone, but her structure remained in the room like a pressure system. I did not wait for his sentence. I turned to the clerk instead. "Please confirm my copy includes transmission receipts once readiness correction sends." "It will, Lieutenant," she said. "You will get digital and hard copy." I nodded, gathered my folder and moved to the door. Behind me, chairs scraped. No one called after me. In the corridor, fluorescent light spilled over wet boot prints and grey tile, and the air smelled of toner, coffee and rain carried in from the loading bay. The same building, the same rank boards on the wall, the same men who had measured me by rumour 3 hours earlier. The only difference was Record. And Record had shifted the centre of gravity in full view. I walked back toward intake with my standing restored on paper and my name restored in the room where they had tried to reduce both. I walked back toward intake with my standing restored on paper and my name restored in the room where they had tried to reduce both, and Captain Reddin was already waiting behind the counter with a fresh stack aligned to the edge, each page tabbed in red where action had been completed. "Transmission receipts," she said, sliding the first sheet toward me. "Readiness corrections sent at 1542 to all recipients of the spouse thread rumour path. Follow-up confirmation at 1549. Legal and command admin copied." I read the language in full. It named me by rank and billet, stated that no suspension had ever existed, and directed all authority questions to formal channels only. Dyer's signature sat at the bottom beside Whitlow's concurrence, both lines tight and pressed hard enough to emboss the paper. Reddin placed a second printout on top. "Family readiness liaison acknowledged and logged correction. Prior verbal request from spouse was categorized as unverified and closed." She tapped the outcome field with her pen. "Closed. You asked for callback outcomes on every external contact. These are complete." I nodded once and moved each receipt into my folder in order, the way I had arranged everything since 0517. Intake stamp, chain transfer, protective orders, authority affirmation, correction proof. "Thank you, Captain." She let out a breath she had been holding all afternoon. "You did not make my day easy, Lieutenant," she said, then added with dry precision, "You made it proper." At 16:03, my phone vibrated in my pocket. "Corporal Rains. Ma'am saw correction notice. I should have said something in the hall. I believed what he said because he said it first." "I am sorry," I typed back while standing at the counter. "Acknowledged. Follow channels. Keep records." He replied in under a minute. "Yes, ma'am." Keeler's message came 3 minutes later, a single line stripped of his earlier smirk. "For record, your continuity model was used unchanged in prep." No reply needed. I read it, saved it, and archived the thread under case materials. Loaded look resolved. He had not defended me when it cost him social ease, but he had put one fact in writing when Record finally mattered. Whitlow and Dyer exited interview room B as I finished logging the messages. Neither approached. Whitlow's gaze met mine for a fraction of a second, then shifted to the wall map as though the painted air corridors had become urgent reading. Dyer paused at the printer, pulled the corrected notice copy he had just signed, and left without speaking. Their silence was not mystery now. It was retreat under documentation. By 1715, the rain had thinned to a fine mist over the loading bay, and Gunnery Sergeant Halverson assembled a short operational huddle in the staging room to revalidate disbursement contingencies before onward movement. He stood at the whiteboard with marker stains on 2 fingers and looked directly at me before he began. "Lieutenant Morrison, take lead on emergency dependency lanes and fraud interruption protocol." No preamble, no apology theatre, no softening phrase for the room. Just billet authority restored in front of every person who had heard the rumour. I stepped to the board and ran the sequence in clipped blocks. Trigger thresholds, validation chain, dual authentication safeguards, mandatory callback script, and escalation handoff to legal within 30 minutes of anomaly detection. I added one line we had not required before. Any spouse-sourced authority claims bypassing command channels are non-actionable until verified in writing. Log the call, route it. Do not improvise. Pens moved across notebooks. No one laughed. At the back row, the lance corporal from the vending machines raised his hand. "Ma'am, for clarity, if hardship code H27 appears during embarkation windows, do we treat it as presumed fraud? Treat it as high risk and time sensitive," I said. "Not presumed, verified fast." Halverson nodded. "Correct. We are not replacing judgment with panic. We are replacing assumptions with process." After the huddle, Keeler waited until the room thinned before he approached. He kept his voice low and formal. "Lieutenant, there is one thing I did not report." He glanced toward the door, then back to me. 3 weeks ago, Pike asked me where hardship recoding sat in the family portal. I assumed it was routine spouse support. I gave him the public helpline and left it there. When he posted about your stability, I connected it and chose not to step in. That was a failure. It was the first unvarnished sentence I had heard from him. Put it in writing for legal, I said. I already did. Submitted at 16:07. I held his gaze long enough to register that he meant it. Then that is your correction. He nodded once and left. At 18:10, Captain Shaw called me back to interview room B for final same-day actions. The room looked less theatrical now, more like what it was, a procedural engine. The resealed USB sat in an evidence bag with a new hash verification sticker. Elaine Voss's print trace had been hole-punched and indexed behind the forensic certificate. Shaw handed me 2 sealed envelopes. Certified copies for your custody. Envelope 1, interim protective financial orders and transmission confirmations to military pay and partner credit union compliance. Envelope 2, command referral packet cover sheet and your authority restoration memorandum. I checked both seals. Received. She moved to the display and pulled up a live confirmation screen from the credit union compliance desk. Freeze executed on contested channels at 1634. Attempted outbound transfer at 1702, denied by hold. That attempt originated from endpoint NPK-home-04 and is now logged as post-notice activity. She looked back at me. Your instinct about timing and architecture was correct. Distinctive details are no longer just your notes, they are findings. The legal clerk entered with a phone on speaker. Compliance Auditor Elaine Voss available for verbal confirmation. Put her through, Shaw said. Voss's voice arrived clean and steady through the small speaker grill. Captain, this is Voss. Confirming receipt of military hold notice, preservation expansion to 6-month look-back, and civil referral submission for restitution routing. Redline advisory group accounts have been flagged for injunctive review. Also confirming 2 prior micro-transfer clusters are now tied in the same chain. Shaw said, Thank you, Ms. Voss. Your earlier transfer protocol preserved evidentiary integrity. Voss answered. Lieutenant Morrison preserved it. I just handed her the sleeve. I spoke into the room. Ms. Voss, thank you for coming in person. Do not thank me yet, she said. Thank me when you keep doing it this way for the next person. The line clicked closed. 3 days later, under a clear, hammered sky and wind that smelled of salt and diesel from the quay, I stood in a compact command legal chamber for the follow-on determination conference. Not a courtroom with spectators, but a formal review room with flags, recording equipment, and enough rank in it to make casual lies expensive. Shaw chaired. Command Finance attended by secure link. Military pay liaison sat to her right. Nolan appeared with counsel and avoided my eyes entirely. Shaw read the determinations without flourish. Finding 1. Deliberate depletion of marital joint funds during complainant embarkation lock window via scheduled transfer ladder. Finding 2. False hardship coding applied to accelerate movement and evade delay controls. Finding 3. Post-notice transfer attempt occurred after protective order service. Immediate remedies. Contested access remains frozen. Restitution initiated through military pay recoupment and civil channel injunction. Complainant emergency support access. Restored and funded. She paused only to allow the recorder to catch up. Administrative separation processing for Staff Sergeant Nolan Pike is referred and accepted for action under fraud-related misconduct provisions. Nolan's counsel asked for softer phrasing around intent. Shaw declined. Intent is supported by schedule metadata, endpoint consistency, shell account control, and post-notice behavior. I signed receipt of the remedy orders with my full name in deliberate block letters. The pay liaison slid a printed confirmation toward me. Lieutenant Morrison, corrective disbursement post to your account tonight at 2100. Temporary advance remains available if needed. Understood. When the session ended, Nolan stood as if to speak, then sat back down when Shaw turned a page and said, No direct contact outside council channels. He didn't finish whatever sentence had risen to his throat. He never did after that. Outside the chamber, Halverson waited near the corridor window with his cover tucked under one arm. Morrison, he said, movement packet updated. You remain lead for dependency control safeguards on the next cycle. Command wants your protocol memo distributed command-wide. Copy, Gunny. He gave me a look I could not misread now. For what it is worth, I should have asked harder questions in the hall that morning. You asked one, I said. You stamped my packet. That mattered. He held my gaze a moment longer, then nodded and stepped aside. Some people never circled back. The spouses who laughed near the brass crest did not write, did not call, did not meet my eyes the next time our paths crossed at readiness check-in. The two officers who had repeated Nolan's old jokes in side corridors offered no apology and no new version. Their silence remained what it had always been. A choice. I stopped treating it like a riddle I needed to solve. That evening at 21:04, my phone showed the corrective deposit posted, holds active, contested channels frozen, and civil restitution case number attached to the compliance thread. I set the device down on the metal desk in my temporary quarters, opened envelope 1, then envelope 2, and checked each page against the digital notices line by line until every item matched. USB resealed and logged, printed trace submitted and indexed, fraud calls answered and closed, rumour path corrected on record, loaded pauses either spoken into statements or left as the silence they chose. Strange details promoted to formal findings. Nothing floating, nothing informal, nothing left in the hands of charm. I stood by the narrow window while floodlights washed the tarmac in pale white and aircraft tails cut dark shapes against the night. My reflection in the glass looked older than it had a week earlier, not from damage but from definition. I had wanted recognition from a man who depended on my diminishment and from rooms that outsourced judgment to confidence. That want had governed me longer than I admitted. It did not govern me now. My name is Casey Morrison, and that was the day the room stopped asking whether I could endure and started admitting I had been right. Silence was not surrender anymore, it was structure, and I walked out funded, cleared and fully mine.